Okay, my name is Lubaina Himid, and I'm here at CAPC because, amazingly and wonderfully, we are showing my cutout installation, Naming the Money. I made this piece over over 2 years, somewhere around sort of 2003, 2004. I spent really more than 18 months making 100 cutout figures. And this 100 cutout figures consists of 10 people multiplied by 10. And they are, I suppose, several kinds of people. They have different trades, certainly. There are 10 different trades. But they also have, if you like, stepped out of paintings. They've stepped out of scenarios in which they were just in the shadows, just at the edges of portraits of great families. Sometimes they were holding the horses, or they were holding pots of tea ready to be poured. So they were always people that were in the sidelines of the history of the great families of Europe. And I made this installation so that all those people could come together, that's a kind of key thing, and talk to each other. So they're not signifiers anymore of somebody else's wealth. They are their own people with their own history, their own names, talking to each other about what it's like to be, I suppose, what it's like to be adrift from their original self. And I guess it is a strange story how this piece came about. I was asked to respond to a museum collection, and which is something that most of my working life, that's how I've made work. Museums ask me to respond to something in their collection so that they can make their collections a little more accessible to audiences from the black diaspora. So there is a sort of desire to open up the collection, perhaps shift the emphasis, or bring up conversations that wouldn't otherwise be had. I'm very interested in sort of changing the course of British history, or opening up gaps, I suppose closing down gaps, but opening up conversations about things that are missing. So I looked in this not very big collection of not very good paintings and rather uninteresting sculptures, and I couldn't find anything that I was interested in working with. So I'd spent, a couple of days looking at all this stuff, and all the time I had been kind of aware of shelves way above the stacks of paintings. And on these shelves were 26 grey plastic boxes, open boxes. And I asked the curator what these boxes were. I wanted to see inside them. And she said, well, she hadn't been working there very long, and she hadn't ever got on a ladder to investigate these boxes. So she didn't know what they were, but she was happy to do it, and she and her team got these boxes down, and we looked under the first piece of tissue. There was a piece of fabric, embroidered fabric, and then as we took all the tissue off out of all the boxes, there were hundreds of pieces of embroidered sleeve, embroidered jacket, parts of pairs of trousers, but all of them fragments of embroidered or patterned cloth. And they were clearly gathered together for their beauty, perhaps not their value, but they were very, very beautiful. Some gold thread, some with beautiful flowers, just sort of exquisite fragments. And I decided there and then that that is what I wanted to respond to. I'm interested in textiles, I'm interested in cloth, in the language that's there, in pattern, the stories that are sort of embedded in fabric and in clothes. And so this seemed like the perfect part of the collection to respond to. The only problem was that the curator still had no idea, once we'd unpacked everything, what these cloths, what these fragments were, because there were no accession numbers and there was no information in her files at all. So my asking her to work with this part of the collection posed a problem, because she then had to spend, in the end, she had to spend months trying to find who had donated these pieces of work and what actually they were. But I mean, that didn't stop me. I just thought, okay, well, she's going to have to try and do that, and I will make some work that speaks to these lost fragments of clothes, these unidentified, very important parts of some people's lives. We could tell immediately that they were all European. You could just tell that they were Italian or French. I later learned that some were Hungarian and Bulgarian, were a combination of peasant clothes, traditional clothes, and things that seemed rather more grand and special than that. And what also happened in that moment was that I remembered, or I think I remember, a set of paintings that I'd seen many, many years before in a small museum in La Rochelle. And the paintings that I think I saw, that I've held in my memory ever since then, through the making of Naming the Money, were paintings that were labelled as gifts from the King of Spain to the King of France. So the paintings were a gift, but also the people depicted in the paintings, Africans, dressed in fabulous clothing, with sashes on which were embroidered, in the reality, but painted in the painting obviously, the name of each of these people and what it was that was special about them, what they did well. They played the lute or played the flute. And I decided in that moment that I wanted to make 10 paintings that reminded me of these, in my kind of, in my mind, lost paintings, but that responded also to the fabric in the collection. So I was trying to link up something that I'd seen many years before to something I was responding to there in the room, and try to make something that that gave, I suppose, enslaved people, lost Africans, a sense of dignity and a sense of self. The sense of dignity and the sense of self that they would have had they never been dragged from wherever they were dragged from in the first place. So I went away that week from the collection and back to my studio and started to think about how I might make this work. And after a couple of weeks, I had an idea which at the time seemed sensible but difficult, and now seems ridiculous and very difficult. And that was to make, instead of making 10 paintings, to make 100 paintings, but on wood, and to have this wood cutouts as silhouettes and freestanding, not leaning against the wall like cutouts I had made in the past, and that audiences would be invited to walk amongst these people, listen to their conversations and listen to their lives. Yes, originally I wanted to call it Gifts to Kings, in direct response to the paintings I had seen in La Rochelle. But that then gave away any agency, any power that the people themselves had. It referred again to their position as just an object to be passed from one person to another, one nation to another. And I realized that what I was doing was talking about why there was such a thing as a trade in slaves. Of course, it's totally and utterly about money. In some ways, it's more about money, the slave trade, than it is about racism or colonialism or hatred. It simply was a way to make more money. And as I was making this work, of course it was expensive to do. I didn't have much money. The commission wasn't a big, prestigious thing. And all the questions about money were very difficult because of my personal circumstances at the time. I mean, I wasn't the sort of artist who was asked to make large commissioned works. That wasn't the realm that I operated in. But as I made them, as I painted each one, I simultaneously was writing the poems, the texts that appear on the reverse of every cutout, and which you can hear in the soundtrack that goes with the installation. And I understood, as I wrote these texts, as I wrote these poems, that what was important to me was that each of these people was an individual person with an individual life, a history, friends, family, something that they did to help the other people in their village or in their group, some way that they contributed to the life that they lived. And I then understood that there's a very important thing in everybody's history, but a particular, there's something particular about the British system, I suppose lots of Northern Europe as well, that if you have a name and you are wealthy and you are perhaps an aristocrat, you can trace your name back and back and back and back, because there are records of who you are and what you did. There are houses that you built. There are whole cities that your family built that had influence. And to some extent, that knowing your history makes you a better person, grander person, often a richer person, a more confident person than anybody who doesn't know their history anymore. And of course, what happened to those African people that were taken from Central Africa and the coasts of West Africa, taken to the Americas, taken to the Caribbean, was that they lost their identity. That nobody wrote their history down. Nobody cared which bit of the coast they came from, which bit of Central Africa they were taken from. They were just commodities. And so gradually, that realization that if you lose your name, the name that you're given, there is something incredibly disconcerting and traumatizing and tragic about that, I guess. And so then, in a sense, the piece became more about naming than about money. as gradually as the whole thing grew, it became more and more important that the people, as themselves, as they really were, became absolutely central to the piece, and less about what had happened to them, and more about what they were going to do about what had happened to them. So that these texts, they read, they say their real name. My name is Lubaina. They call me, Sally. And I start like that because in many of the bigger aristocratic houses of the time, if you had a whole group of servants, of course you couldn't be bothered to remember all their names. Why would you bother? They're just servants. So you make a decision to call all your chambermaids Sally, all your grooms looking after your horse John, all the people digging your garden George. So then if you needed any of those people, you could just call a name and somebody would come. So I wanted to sort of emphasize that, but emphasize that within that, people try really hard to hang on to who they actually are. And so then the person talks about what they used to do before this dislocation happened to them. And they talk about what they do now, which is sometimes very related to what they used to do, and sometimes not related at all to what they used to do. And in the final line of each text, there's a sense of hope and redemption, I suppose, somehow, that this person is determined to make the best of this dislocation, the best of being in this place, and the best of making something of their lives. And that sort of text seemed important to me because all of us, wherever we come from or whoever we are, whatever audiences we are for this piece, also have some of that sense of hanging on to your identity, hanging on to what's important to you, even though something deeply traumatic may never have happened to you. You may just have wanted to be a dancer and then met a man who you married and you live in another city and you lose contact with the other people that you used to dance with, and you have children and they call you mummy, they don't call you your name, and their friends call you Jacques mummy, and the only thing you do that's anything to do with dance is maybe go to the ballet or take your children to dancing classes. But sometimes when you're driving there, you remember the steps that you used to take, and you remember why you care that your children enjoy the kind of music that goes with dancing. So there's a way in to this piece for everybody that wants to engage with it. And one of the most astonishing and important things about showing this piece here is that it is a building in which the goods that many of the people that I'm talking about, their ancestors, their relatives, they're the goods that those people were helping to manufacture or were part of the triangular trade. So some of the goods that came in and out of this building were things like tobacco and rum and spices. It was a space that must have smelled incredible, must have smelled of somewhere else entirely. The whole atmosphere in the place must have filled with, I don't know, if you like, even the workers that were here, the French warehousemen that were here, will have been able to almost hear the sea, smell the spices as they were picked, imagine other places, other people. And although now the building has a kind of solemnity about it, it was putting this installation here was a kind of great opportunity to fill it again with life, I guess, with people and people's histories and people's stories, and an opportunity to kind of link the two together, link an incredibly important warehouse that seemed almost like a crossroads, a world of its own, a sort of almost a huge signifier of wealth and achievement in Bordeaux, with some of the people that were also part of that crisscrossing, part of that wealth building, part of that lost identity, and mix the two together, and really perhaps have an opportunity with this piece to open up some conversations about that trade and about what it made of this city, but also how much contribution the people from the African diaspora have made to the grandeur, the beauty, and the wealth of Europe. Yes, all the way through the experience of being in this installation, you hear many different kinds of music. You hear a South African woman called Miriam Makeba singing. You hear an Irish woman singing Irish folk song. You hear a small group of classical musicians playing early music, Baroque music by Marat Marais. You hear John Coltrane. You hear Cuban musicians. And it depends how long a member of the audience spends within the installation, but you could have a whole experience, say you spent 15 minutes with the artwork, you could have a whole experience that gave you these people and their conversations in an atmosphere of a jazz club, or the atmosphere of the early French Baroque music. And you can see how that then colours your experience in a completely different way. And what I was trying to do with this soundtrack, as well as fill the air in the same way as I suppose the air was filled with smells, I wanted to fill the air with the sounds of somewhere else, but also illustrate that people from the African diaspora have been influencing music as well as the visual for a very long time. Whether that influence is direct from the music of Africa to the music of the African American jazz players, or something that's indirect, that's simply to do with songs about leaving places, or songs about leaving your family behind, or music that exists because it was commissioned by incredibly wealthy aristocratic people who may or may not have made their money by exploiting other people. So the music is trying to do a lot of different things. But what I'm also doing, while this music is playing, as it changes from one style to another, I'm reading the texts that can be read on the back of every single cutout. So you have a way of hearing the voices of those people if you don't want to read it. But of course the brilliant thing here in Bordeaux is that the team here have translated every single one of those texts into French, and that's projected on the wall. And this for me was, I mean, I didn't ask them to do it, but it's an act of, you know, if I thought of it, I would have been absolutely delighted. I am delighted, because it means that, because all the texts are in English, because that's the only language I speak, the stories that those people were telling would have been cut off from the people who don't speak English, who speak French. And so they now have the opportunity to listen to those stories and to read the stories and perhaps bring their own stories into the room with mine. It's very interesting to see my series of 9 paintings, Zanzibar, in the same space as the installation Naming the Money, because both are about leaving a place, leaving somewhere where you belong and trying to make a life somewhere where you don't belong, but where you're trying to belong. The 2 pieces were made, the 2 sets of work were made maybe 4 or 5 years apart. And I made the Zanzibar paintings 2 years after I went back to Zanzibar, having left it something like 45 years previously. So I left Zanzibar when I was 4 months old, when my father died, and my mother, my English mother, took me back to England, or took me to England for the first time. She went back to England. And I never went back to Zanzibar until at least 4.5 decades later. And these paintings were, in some way, me trying to, trying to understand why it had taken me so long to go back. Because I think in the meantime, in the 20 years of paintings that I had made previously, I was trying a lot of the time to understand that place and make paintings that were of that place but not of that place. So I went to Cuba, I made paintings about the buildings that I'd seen there. I was in Venice, I made a lot of paintings about that place, and I found that those were places that maybe would help me understand Zanzibar when I finally got there. And when I did get there, I spent a lot of the time wandering around the streets, as I do in places, and a lot of the time staring out to sea, remembering what my mother had told me about the trauma of her leaving. And these paintings are really very wet. They're very watery, and they're full of tears, and they're full of the sea, and they're full of rain. And I've never made a series of paintings before that are like that, or since, that have that sense of sorrow, I think, and loss, and I guess absence and unbelonging. And so to see them in this space where they occupy a space in the gallery, I suppose the strange thing that happens is when you're walking around the installation Naming the Money, occasionally you glimpse one of the Zanzibar paintings, and the Zanzibar painting almost comes into the space, and then it goes out of the space. And when you're looking at the Zanzibar paintings, they're hung on a very dark, very beautiful grey, and you find yourself in that space with them. They're quite somber. You get more from them when you're very close to them than you do when you're far away from them. But you you're sort of in a different space again, a sort of separate space then to Naming the Money. But you're free to wander in and out of both sets of work, both series. Hopefully, I think what sort of seems to be happening to me in this is the strength that you can find in naming the money helps to deal with the sorrow that you find in Zanzibar. But this is a completely new experience because they've never really hung in quite this way before. They've been in the same gallery space. There are hints before of that conversation, but now the threads are moving backwards and forwards. I suppose for the past 30 years, I've also, as well as making artwork almost every day, I've been teaching in an art school, in an art department in Lancashire, in the north of England, a place called the University of Central Lancashire. And within that, in recent years, maybe in the last 15 years, I've led this research project called Making Histories Visible. And that has run alongside my teaching and run alongside my making. And it started really as simply an archive of much of the work that I did in the 1980s, organizing exhibitions, small exhibitions, but sometimes small exhibitions in quite large venues in London. And these exhibitions were the work of other black women artists that I knew at the time. I was interested in their work, interested in the way that each of us had a completely different way of making and a completely different way of dealing with our place in the 1980s as almost invisible people. It was a strange time when you could open a newspaper in Britain, you would never see a black face. You could watch the television, you would never see anybody black. And we started to make work, as I say, completely differently from each other, to make ourselves visible. So much of this research project has evidence of the beginnings of these sorts of conversations, has exhibition invitations, has transparencies with artworks, it has the books that we were reading, the music that we were listening to. And gradually, as the years went by, I collected more of the catalogues that artists then began to have, the posters, and people gave me things to add to this, this small set of things that I started with. And I guess what happens in the archive space, what happens in the research centre, is that conversations happen. Conversations happen about the cleverness or not of that strategy to make exhibitions and call them 5 Black Women at the Africa Centre or Black Woman Time Now. You know, it's a label that we gave ourselves, but that many people since, many artists since, have found burdensome because they want to be known as artists, not black artists. And I have these conversations with young people, and absolutely, I want to say, and I do say, yes, you have to do whatever is the right thing for you to do at this time. So this is how we did this project. This is the only way we knew how to do this. We were starting almost from nothing, we thought. And as the years have gone by, each generation of young black British artists has had to deal with the different shifts in the politics that have happened, the different acknowledgements and disappearances that have happened, the early deaths that have happened to us as a set of artists. And some of those conversations are absolutely the conversations that run through all my work. What is belonging? Who are we? What can we make of who we are? How can we change things? audience is incredibly important to me and always has been. I trained as a theatre designer, so that heat, the heat and the dust, I sometimes call it, from an audience that penetrates a performance is still present in an art gallery. And I think that anyone who thinks about audiences as some anonymous blob over there that is annoying or asks questions or doesn't agree or it doesn't think or is always complaining, hasn't really thought that an audience is made up of actual living human beings who have their own histories and narratives and their own reasons for being curious about the visual. So they come to exhibitions to match their experience of something visual to something they're seeing in the gallery space. And in their heads all the time are these conversations about what they've seen before, what they're going to have for lunch, what their families are doing, how their families are reflected in this artwork or not, how their dreams are reflected in this artwork or not. And so these sorts of conversations about audiences, about histories of exhibitions, about what makes an artist, are current all the time and threaded through the work I make, which is why often I make paintings that refer to other paintings, quite often paintings that refer to the history of British painting, how to infiltrate myself, my history, other African people's history into the history of British painting by stealing a motif, by taking a composition and reworking it, redefining it, so that you look at that painting, you think, I know that from somewhere, but I'm not sure where I know it from. But it's quite clear, usually in the title, the origin. So that again and again I come back to the sense of, or the question about belonging. I was saying earlier that in English, belonging is a good thing when you belong to a family or you belong to a place, and belonging is a bad thing when you belong to someone else.